This is the 11th video in a series that is designed to help you give useful information to the Jehovah's Witnesses so that they can make informed decisions about their religious beliefs. It is intended to do for the Jehovah's Witnesses what you would want done for you if you were a witness. In this series you'll be studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses in their favorite publication, this book, What Does the Bible Really Teach? You'll be reading each paragraph and giving the answer that is in the paragraph, but putting it in your own words. You do not need to personally agree with the information. I will be giving you background information and suggest what else you should say and what questions to ask. In this series, I only discuss those issues that are contrary to the mainstream evangelical community. I do not critique alternative beliefs that may be unpopular but are still accepted. Therefore, as you discuss this book, you may find things in here that you disagree with, but I do not discuss it in any of these videos. That means the subject you disagree with is an alternative view that is accepted within evangelical Christianity. So do not make the Jehovah's Witnesses uncomfortable with your disagreement. It is important to let the witness know that these other views are tolerated within the mainstream evangelical community, even though you may not personally agree. The issue for this video is on page 74, paragraphs 23 and 24. Here, okay? It's on the subject of who goes to heaven, and the title is Real Hope for Your Loved Ones Who Have Died. And it talks about going to heaven and their teaching about how many go to heaven. And they teach that only 144,000 people ever will be going to heaven and be there. They believe that the rest of humankind will live on earth, and that was that picture there of what people will be like living on earth. That's the rest of humanity that is judged worthy to live in the kingdom. So the question on these paragraphs is, who makes up Jesus' little flock, and how many will they number? And you can answer that the book says 144,000. But in preparation for this, you want to put in the margins two verses, two passages. Isaiah 54, verses 1 through 8, and Galatians 4, verses 22 through 31. Now the scriptures say that few people out of all who have ever lived will be accepted into the kingdom. That's taken from Matthew 7, verse 14. Yet these verses in Isaiah 54 and Galatians 4 show that the total number in heaven will be larger than all the Jews ever born. And we're going to see that. You can introduce this by saying something like, I have a question. The way this is worded is a new thought to me, and my religious community explains it differently, so I need your help to sort it out. My community would say that the 144,000 is just a subset of all the Christians who are going to heaven. They are the ones who specifically lived during the Great Tribulation and are murdered for their faith. I was under the impression that the total of all people in the heavenly Jerusalem above would be more than all the Jews who were ever born, and that it is a lot more than 144,000. I do agree, though, that it is a small number in comparison to the whole world population. I learned this viewpoint from two passages, Isaiah 54, 1 through 8, and Galatians 4, 22 through 31. Maybe you could research that and tell me how you see those passages. And then let them research it and give you an answer. They may ask you for an explanation of how you see it, so you can say this. Okay? In the Bible, Isaiah 54, 1 through 8 is about one thing. Isaiah foretells how the entire nation of Israel was to be exiled for sins against God, and how they would one day return home to Jerusalem and have more inhabitants than ever before. In this passage, the nation of Israel is likened to a woman married to God. Yet it is abandoned by God and left desolate with apparently no children because she was unfaithful. However, she would later be blessed and would one day have more children than the previous married woman, Israel, who had at one time filled the area with inhabitants or children. That is the entire prophetic message of this passage in Isaiah 54. So keep in mind that although this refers to two women in Isaiah 54, it has nothing to do with the two women, Sarah and Hagar, who Paul is going to mention, also mentioned in Galatians chapter 4. Okay? Now let's turn to Galatians 4, 22 through 31. Paul discusses two illustrations. Each illustration refers to two women. One illustration is from Isaiah 54, which we just read, and refers to a figurative, a barren woman who doesn't have a name, and it's contrasted with the earlier fruitful woman, a figurative woman, of course, and thus this illustration refers to Israel both before and after the exile, and likens those two groups to two women, without names, of course. But also in Galatians, Paul gives a second, different illustration of two real, literal women, Hagar and Sarah. Hagar is the first to bear fruit, children, and for a time Sarah is barren. Sarah eventually bears a child with descendants that are more numerous than the stars, according to Genesis 22:17. Now Paul combines both these two illustrations in his teachings here in Galatians 4, so it can be kind of confusing with all these women being discussed. So to keep this straight, remember there are basically two women. The first is a fruitful woman bearing lots of children, or appears to, and the second is barren for a time, but will eventually have more children than the first. Paul is mostly speaking about the pair Hagar and Sarah. And Sarah had more children than Hagar, even though Sarah appeared barren. But in verse 27, he momentarily switches to bring in the parallel illustration of the two unnamed women from Isaiah 54, which we read. Paul's point is that the second woman, who appears to be abandoned, will have more children or inhabitants than the first, apparently blessed woman. Okay, what is so interesting about this and how it applies is that Paul takes these two illustrations and applies them not to Israel before and after the exile, as what was done in Isaiah 54, nor is he applying it to Hagar and Sarah, but he applies them to a new pair of figurative women, namely earthly Israel on earth, okay, which is what Paul calls the present Jerusalem there in Galatians 4, that appears to be blessed with many Jewish children, and contrasts her, the Jerusalem below, with a second woman who is appears to be anyway, unmarried, called the Jerusalem above. This is where the Christian congregation is destined to live, of course, in the Jerusalem above. What does Paul conclude about these two women? The Jerusalem below and the Jerusalem above. Although the first woman, the Jerusalem below, appears to be blessed with many children and all the Jews ever born, at the time that Paul wrote that, it is the second woman, the Jerusalem above, who will eventually have more children, more inhabitants than the Jerusalem below. That's the message that Paul gives there as he draws upon Isaiah 54. This leads to the conclusion that the heaven, the Jerusalem above, will eventually have more inhabitants than all the Jews ever born, which represents the Jerusalem below. So if the Jehovah's Witnesses ask you to clarify your question, you give this explanation, but let them research it and give their answer. Just listen to their answer. They may ask you to repeat this explanation, but don't argue with them. Just listen to it and say you'll think about it and move on to the next subject.